Well, I guess it's good to start at the beginning. I mean, maybe even before the beginning, how when we get started talking about the way we come into form, there's always an intention.
Right.
Mm.
And I can say that I was a family therapist working with lots of young children and families, and then went into being ready to have my own family. And so, pre and perinatal health and psychology is really a place where it's touched the personal as well as the professional with me. And what happened to me is when I was pregnant with my first child, I discovered that I had a uterine abnormality that caused premature labor. And so with my first daughter, she was born very, very early. And then I spent 6 months in bed giving myself acupuncture with my second daughter and managed to carry her closer to term so that she never had to be away from me. But then when I was pregnant with my youngest, my son, although I did the same things, I did go into labor early. And what had happened with him is I'd been pregnant with twins, and I'd miscarried his twin at the end of the 4th month. So there was major prenatal trauma for him to lose his twin, and then he was born really 7 weeks early, and he had to spend time in a neonatal intensive care unit. And I could just tell from the time I took him home that his whole nervous system was completely dysregulated. He wasn't able to settle. He had difficulty coming into nursing. And I just vowed that when he was big enough, I was going to study early trauma and what you could do about it, because even though I was an experienced mom and an experienced therapist, no one I talked to had any idea what was going on. And so when he grew up and got to be 8 and 9, I started studying pre and perinatal psychology, and discovered at that time it actually had a long history. So maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about what informs pre and perinatal psychology and what its history is.
And some of the key people that you've met along the way too, that you think are
Right.
important. Yeah.
Well, it really started coming into the scientific literature in the 1950s, more in Britain and in Europe. And two people that stand out are Frank Lake and Otto Rank. And they were psychologists, psychiatrists who noticed that when patients were suicidal, they often had the experience of their mother attempting to abort them, and they would use the same method in a suicide attempt. And so that got those psychiatrists really interested in prenatal psychology and how it carries into our life. And then I guess the next really big figure is John Bowlby, who was I guess we could call him the grandfather of attachment research. And he discovered that young children hospitalized and separated from their parents are really affected by that experience in the long term, and that it changes their relationship to themselves and to their parents. And so since then, in the 70s, in the 80s, attachment research came to North America. Alan Strofe in the University of Minnesota, big center of attachment research. here in Virginia, also University of California, Berkeley. And some psychiatrists, psychologists began to develop a way of working with these prenatal and birth and very early precognitive memories in a clinical way to help people heal even though they were adults. So that's really some of the history. And what's happening in the field now is very exciting.
Yeah.
It's really an integration of many different knowledge bases. What's happening in cell biology, the Human Genome Project, and now epigenetics.
And fetal origins, yeah, and interpersonal biology.
Yeah.
The whole field is really becoming integrated.
Yes, the last 15 years, what we've learned from neuroscientists about how our brain and nervous system actually develops has really informed this field, and we're coming to an understanding of what prenatally babies need, what they need during birth, and in that first year of life, even the first 3 years of life, to help their brain and nervous system grow in the most optimal way. And that's what's so exciting about living at this time in this particular field.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think I've really witnessed a big change in the 13 years that I've been practicing. So it's exciting to be a practitioner at this time.
Yes, we really have the evidence-based science in our Western traditions to support what we know about babies and children and what we know about optimal birthing and optimal child rearing.
Right.
And what we really understand now from attachment research is what experiences we have in our prenatal time through our birth and that first year especially. It determines our relationship to ourself. It determines how we cope with stress, how we relate to other people. It affects our capacity to learn. And even more surprising, it has a major impact on our physical health decades later. We know now that 50% of the cause of chronic physical conditions we develop in middle age are directly related to what happened to us in utero. And we also understand psychologically 75% of mental health issues, their etiology or the cause of them is what happened to us, our experiences in that very early time. So we're really setting up the template for the rest of our life.
Yeah, for health.
For health, our immune system health, our cardiovascular health, how we regulate glucose, all of these major areas.
Right. Also, some of the ancestral patterns, we call them ancestral, but some of the things that happened to our mother and our mother's mother and what happened around them too can influence who we are today. So part of that is the science of pre and perinatal too.
Right. That's what we call one of those foundational pieces, epigenetics. We know now that what our grandmothers experienced, what our parents experienced, can actually change our genome. When the Human Genome Project started, scientists thought they'd discover 125,000 human genes. When that 10-year study was done, they realized we only have about 25,000 genes. But what we have is something called the epigenome. It's like the interface between the environment in our genome, and it takes in the experience, tells our genome which genes to turn on, which genes to turn off. So if our mother doesn't eat well in pregnancy, our body grows itself preparing for a life of starvation. So we tend to gain weight as we age because our body thinks it's not going to have enough food.
Yeah.
That's a very simple way of talking about a
Okay, yeah.
really complex science.
It's true. Okay, is there a case study that you can talk about to illuminate some of these things that you just talked about?
A big research project that is very close to home and very close to our hearts is what happened to those unborn babies inside their mothers who were in the Twin Towers.
Or even nearby. I mean,
Or-
even in New York City, yeah.
Even in New York City. And those children who were born after that have been very closely studied. And what we understand about them is because of that intense stress that their mothers experienced there, that they have a highly reactive nervous system. And even at age 3, almost all those children were still highly sensitive, highly reactive, and as they grew older, have had more learning and behavioral difficulties than has been unusual in our culture at large. And part of it has depended on how their parents were able to respond and integrate their experience
Yeah.
there as their children were growing up.
But also that was a major stressor. That was a big event. And I know that from listening to you that different kinds of stress have different impact on
Right.
moms and babies.
Yes, that was one huge acute stress that lasted over a number of days. A very high level of chronic stress where the mother feels she can't control or manage her environment and always too much is being asked of her and she's completely overwhelmed can also affect babies. And just for all the mothers and fathers listening, we actually know mild to moderate stress can be very positive for unborn babies. It's this really high level of very chronic stress or a really acute major stressor that can affect babies in utero.
But when moms hear that, I mean, they immediately go in their head to, okay, what's the stress in my life and how can I manage that? And they want more information. So I feel like there's probably ways that we can educate more about stress and the impact of it and how to be with it so that it has less impact on the unborn.
Right. Well, if I was living in the ideal world with a magic wand, I would have every pregnant mom be able to stop work by the middle of the 6th or the end of the 6th month of pregnancy, so she had lots of relaxation, self-care, massages in that last trimester of pregnancy. I really wouldn't want her to have to go back to work as early as many moms do. That at minimum, absolutely minimum, she could stay home for the first year and not really have to go back to work and meet the demands of the outside world. And I know just saying that that's not the situation that many of our families are in. And it's really difficult to talk about the impact that has on babies because little ones, if they're 6 weeks old, 3 months old, and they have to go into childcare, it's just too much stimulation, too much change. It's overwhelming for their little nervous systems. And they tend to get much more dysregulated and have more difficulty with eating, with sleeping, and later on with their behavior.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
But I know from listening to you over the years, Myrna, that there are ways that we can help families. And one of the most difficult things I find when I'm working with families is that we have to deal what's real. And I give moms this saying sometimes, our greatest challenge is living in the greatest spiritual challenge is living in the real world. And
Right.
so what's real for these families is many of them do have to work up until their due date, do have to go back. So what kinds of things, what's optimal? Why don't we just paint the picture for what's optimal
Well,
for